Our monthly theme for June is power. You may have seen a sermon title for today in the June newsletter. Forget about that. As sometimes happens, as this day came closer, I realized I wanted to say something different. So today, I've written a sermon that I call, longest sermon title ever, The War in Our Spirits, Peace, Interfaith Work, and the Power of Self-Reflection. My generation, I'm on the young side of Generation X, was significantly shaped by the World Trade Center attacks on September 11th, 2001. We were in our early to mid-20s when the seemingly unassailable buildings collapsed in eruptions of fire and dust. People jumping from skyscrapers to escape, dust-covered people in business suits crying out for their loved ones, some of our first experience as citizens, as adult working citizens. Many of us in Generation X and the millennial generation that followed were shaped by those days similarly to the way previous generations were shaped by Pearl Harbor. But in retrospect, another image, which many at the time thought was heroic, seems now deeply tragic. You may remember the Bullhorn Moment. 3 days after the towers fell, then President Bush, just a few months into his first term, stood beside a New York firefighter, grabbed his bullhorn, and began to thank the rescue workers. Do you remember this? One of the rescue workers shouted, "We can't hear you." And President Bush called back, "I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knocked these buildings down will hear from all of us soon." And the workers began chanting, "USA, USA." And in that moment, the president had given voice to the deep American desire to flex our muscles, to use our power to smash the people who did this. In the days after the Bullhorn, the pursuit of those who bombed the buildings became a war on terrorism that 15 years on has spread around the globe. Many argue, me among them, that this war on terrorism has been as effective in creating terrorists as it has been in defeating them. The Bullhorn Moment, though I have to say I get it and understand that these things are complicated, but the Bullhorn Moment is a symbol for me of a missed opportunity to de-escalate conflict on a global scale, to emphasize relationship over revenge. I have loved ones who have gone off to fight in these wars. I respect their courage, and I have witnessed the irreparable damage done to them. Peace among nations can seem like a dream. Yet, I gain hope from the words of Unitarian great Julia Ward Howe. Her Mother's Day proclamation in 1870 was read by some powerful people from this pulpit last month. She wrote, "We will not have great questions decided by irrelevant agencies. Our husbands shall not come to us reeking with carnage for caresses and applause. Our sons shall not be taken from us to unlearn all that we've been able to teach them of charity, mercy, and patience. We women of one country will be too tender of those of another country to allow our sons to be trained to injure theirs. From the bosom of the devastated earth, a voice goes up with our own. It says, 'Disarm, disarm. The sword of murder is not the balance of justice.'" Julia Ward Howe here pulls the vision of a world at peace down from the ethereal, where it seems impossible, to a place where we can begin to see its possibility in relationships, specifically in the family. In the family, the human price of revenge can be really felt, and Ward Howe suggests peace can begin with family-centered resistance. Another religious great takes it a step further. At the risk of using another quote that I used a few months ago, Thomas Merton once wrote, "Instead of hating the people you think are war makers, hate appetites and disorders in your own soul, which are the causes of war. If you love peace, then hate injustice, hate tyranny, hate greed, but hate these things in yourself, not in another." Julia Ward Howe and Thomas Merton remind us that peace begins to be possible when we claim the power to change our own behavior. Then we can begin to have meaningful relationships with people who don't agree with us on every point of doctrine. Peace in the world is inextricably linked to relationships. I was once given personal feedback, something like that. 10 years ago now, I was new to Unitarian Universalist ministry and was going through what's called clinical pastoral education. You may have heard me mention that from here before. It's hospital-centered training with a group of other ministers. You go make visits out in the hospital, then you come back and reflect on those visits with other ministers. The goal is self-awareness, which leads to the ability, you hope, to minister to people who don't agree with you theologically. It is wonderful preparation for work in a Unitarian Universalist congregation. Well, I was, in that particular moment, in an angry agnostic or atheist, I don't know, phase in my life. I'm still agnostic, who isn't to one degree or another, but I'm not angry anymore, most days. But back then, I was still fussing at the God I said I didn't believe in anymore, the God I was leaving behind as I broke away from the faith of my youth. So my colleagues would come back from a visit and they would say that they had been on the general medical wing praying for someone who had the flu, and I would get hooked. And I'd say, why don't you go pray for the healing of this child I just visited in the cancer ward and tell me how that goes. I was razor sharp. And when I made an argument, sometimes the group would fall silent, and I thought, I got him. I became expert at arguing my conservative colleagues into corners. My CPE supervisor, who was trained to help shepherd us through that important learning time, God bless her, said at one point, Andy, you need to be aware of the impact you have on a group. And I thought, she's telling me I'm a powerful person, and I need to have the self-esteem to see that. She gets me. Of course, what she saw was that my anger was getting in the way of my forming relationships. It kept me from serving patients well. When I was finally able to listen to my colleagues, rather than prepping my arguments against them, I heard their doubt. I heard them being uncertain, but committing to their faith traditions, committing to speaking in that language. I came to admire them while holding to my own faith tradition. And my CPE supervisor's words began to have a different effect. Become aware of the impact you have on a group. Maybe she meant I had the power either to connect with people or to try to out-argue them. And maybe I was making the wrong choice. In the most recent issue of the Unitarian Universalist World, our periodical, UUA President Peter Morales writes that the future of liberal religion, and I would argue perhaps the greatest possibility for peace in the world, is multi-faith cooperation. I could not agree more. If we're serious about spreading values of love, peace, and justice, we must work with partners of other faiths. You know, that sort of hit home for me when I was researching last week's sermon on transgender issues, and there's been some statistical work done recently that suggests that there are point-something% of the population is transgender. 700,000 people. There are only 500,000 Unitarian Universalists. We're a small group of people, in a way. We have to work with partners of other faiths. But Boston, we have a problem. Boston's where our headquarters are. That's why that joke is funny. In case I'm here to help. In that same issue, Jennifer Howe Peace, who's associate professor of Interfaith Studies at Andover Newton Seminary, talks about the challenges for Unitarian Universalists that are inherent in interfaith work. This is just part of that article. She writes, the goal is to get to the point where we don't see sameness as the price of entrance for interfaith work, Building interfaith relationships that accommodate difference is not rocket science, she says, but it's not easy. It takes time, patience, and understanding, and requires a conscious decision to uphold the relationship. She continues, with a stated openness to all religions, Unitarian Universalists might assume that their denomination thrives at interfaith work. While such a potential exists, particular pitfalls in the UU community can be particularly hard to see, says Peace. For one, UUs, she writes, tend to be exclusivist pluralists. Play around with that in your head a little bit. Meaning you'll talk to anyone as long as they agree with your openness to everyone. She says this stance reduces working with less ideologically porous groups to a superficial interaction. Here's how I would describe it. We are a movement which cut its teeth preaching against other religious traditions. American Unitarianism and Universalism, and later Unitarian Universalism after the merger, but particularly Unitarianism and Universalism separately, grew up in the 18th and 19th century America, preaching the goodness of humanity and the love of God over against fundamentalist Calvinists who were preaching a vengeful God and humans born sinful. Over time, we as a movement became really good at making effective, logical religious arguments. We can be, sometimes, we can be less good at listening to those whose faith comes from another place. Here's another way to think about this problem. They say in weightlifting circles, don't skip leg day. Have you heard this? It's all important, the whole body, but leg day is so hard and you kind of feel like you're walking on Jell-O when you're finished. But if you only lift with your arms, your chest, and your back, you get great big muscles on your legs, or your arms, your chest, and your back. And teeny tiny little twig legs. Well, historically, if listening well to interfaith partners could be thought about as leg day, it's hard. We have sometimes skipped leg day. Our arguing muscles are huge. Logic and reason and the value of every person as a principle. These are strong muscles, and they've served us well and continue to. We can't forget them. But our shrinking world is calling for us to flex humility and listening muscles that may not always come naturally to us. To risk being changed by our partners, to risk learning something from them, rather than doing most of the talking. We'll get better and better, but we need to work on it. Well, the good news is that work is happening. I once assumed that Unitarian Universalists and Mormons, for example, had little in common. Then I visited the temple grounds in Salt Lake City 7 or 8 years ago. I was wandering around the campus in one of the chapels when I encountered two 20-something missionaries. These two women were incredibly gracious with their time. They told me all about their history and the theology of their movement, and one of them asked what I do for a living. That's always a decision point for me. Do I tell the truth? Or do I tell them I bag groceries? When I told them the truth, one of them said, "That's great, I'm kind of a Buddhist Mormon." Well, I was just blown away. And that revealed my assumption that Mormons were completely different from me in important ways. Turns out I was wrong. Their faith was really different from mine, yet these two people and I had important points of theological commonality. And here at VUU, we work with Mormon partners pretty often, including their bringing in meals to feed our homeless guests in our sanctuary. They just served dinner here Monday evening, as a matter of fact. Some think Mormons and Unitarian Universalists are polar opposites, but it just isn't so. Interfaith work of this sort, where we can stop grouping people and think we know who they are, and meet individuals of other faiths, get to know them, it's essential. Relationship is key. That's a big part of what changed my mind about those colleagues in the hospital. I came to love and respect them, and I wanted to know more about them. And they, thankfully, didn't give up on me. We Unitarian Universalists who believe, as I said last week, that every single person is a child of that great love which some call God. We have a great theological foundation for interfaith relationship work. But it requires, I think, a bit of a pivot. We can no longer be satisfied to be a gathering place for like-minded religious liberals. Instead, I think we need to see ourselves as one group of religious liberals among many. Liberal Jews and liberal Mormons, with whom we've marched in the Pride Parade, by the way, and on and on. With the goal of changing the world toward more love together. In our work, there are potential partners all over the place. Having a disagreement does not disqualify us as partners who can be in relationship. In an age of instant and ubiquitous experts on everything, from quantum physics to beer making, what we need for peace, it seems to me, is not just more information, but genuine relationship based on shared humanity and humility. That, I think, is where we'll find the power to change the world. So let us examine our assumptions about people of all the world's faiths. Let us lean into discomfort, become curious about perceived difference, rather than running away or arguing. A more peaceful world beckons. It's leg day, friends. We can do it. Amen.